Yeah, that's a very good question. I never ever wanted to become a researcher. I was really passionate about teaching. Originally, I'm from the Netherlands, and I basically taught economics at Maastricht University. And I really noticed that every time that I was teaching, my students were always reacting differently, although I was the same teacher. So I became really fascinated about group dynamics and also trying to understand um, basically why people react differently to learning materials and to educators. So yeah, in order to stay in academia, I eventually had to do this stupid thing called a PhD. And yeah, now everyone just recognizes me as a researcher, but I never wanted to go into research in the first place. So I was just really a passionate teacher. Yeah, I guess with the pandemic, everyone has experienced online learning in some shape or form. According to UNESCO, there were 1.6 billion learners and educators who suddenly had to switch online. And I think for some, it has been a really good experience because it gave them the opportunity, the access, the flexibility. But we also have heard lots of stories about people who were absolutely not satisfied with the online learning experience and are happy to be back in classes. And I think what we've learned with the online pivot is that oftentimes the shift has been made to online in a hurry. And in many institutions, the shift has also been let's copy paste what we know. Let's go to, for example, online lectures. But many of our students basically don't seem to particularly like this. So I think overall what we've learned in the last 2 years is that there's an increased recognition that online learning is really important and that hybrid learning and online learning is here to stay. But to doing it well is, I think, the crux. And I think both educators and learners are expecting hybrid and online learning, but we need to improve how we're delivering that in the best way possible. Yeah, I think what in particular we've noticed is that if you design the course well around the student needs and making sure that whatever they need is matched with the course rather than the other way around, that you do a one-size-fits-all solution that you think will work. So it's really trying to understand who is in front of your screen and trying to understand what are they looking for. And if you are able to better understand what learners are expecting, then you can also better fine tune your course design or your learning design to make sure that you're also delivering those experiences. Yeah, on the one hand, of course, the online pivot has really empowered institutions to, well, gather lots of data about both their learners and their learning behavior, as well as teachers and their teacher behavior. So this is great because we can then start to see, okay, what works for one type of learner, but not for another, or what works for one type of teacher, but not the other. But I think the biggest challenge for most institutions across the globe is how to make sense of all this data. And the second big and related challenge is how do we then empower both learners and educators to make the best use of this data? And what we have, for example, seen at the Open University UK, which probably is the largest institution in Europe using learning analytics, it is a real challenge to help people to understand A, the data, but also B, to do then actions on that data. So there's a huge challenge ahead still. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So for example, at the Open University, we make all the data of our students available to our 7,000 online teachers. So we have around 200,000 students following courses as we speak. And how do we ensure that those 7,000 teachers have readily available data that they can actually use? And that's a real challenge. And we've basically further optimized our learning analytics dashboards in the last 7 years using a program called OU Analyze. And we can also see from the data that some teachers absolutely love it and some teachers never use it. But at the same time, we can see that those teachers who actively use it are better able to support our students. So the real crucial question is how can we make sure that our educators are not only intrinsically motivated to look at data, but also are able to actionably do some kind of, well, support or intervention. And that is really, really difficult. I guess the only way forward in this is a combination of a good infrastructure, but more importantly, also focus on the professional development of our staff. And that could literally be, how can I, as a teacher, make sense of all this data? It looks really fuzzy. There's all these numbers and et cetera, to, okay, I understand the data, but what's the next step I can do to actually support our students? So I guess the biggest leap that our own institution still has to make is, okay, how do we then involve also our students into this picture? Because we have all this data about our students, but oftentimes it's mostly humans, aka the teacher, making decisions. And I think that's another really interesting challenge that I'm keen to work on in the next couple of years. Yeah, so my biggest tip, and I'm already giving away my keynote, is to start small and start with a small group of people. So really try to understand, okay, how do teachers work in terms of making sense of the data, and how can we further improve the learning analytics dashboards based on their feedback? So we've always started small and gradually further extended the reach so that the data and the dashboards are relevant to teachers, and then using those teachers as champions to bring in other teachers. So it's a combination of kind of top down with bottom up, of championing the experiences by teachers. But of course, this is a slow process. It's one teacher at a time. And we can know from, for example, one of my PhD students has looked using eye tracking what teachers actually see when they're working through the dashboards. And they're really making interesting, fantastic stories about what's happening, which is factually not true. So it's also highlighting, in terms of professional development, it's trying to get a really deep understanding of how people make sense of all this data, and not correcting people if they misinterpret data, but helping them to become critical citizens themselves in terms of, okay, I'm thinking this student is doing this, but is this really what the student is doing? And maybe just having a call or a talk with a student could probably already help. I think the most important first step is to identify what are you really interested in. So in terms of problem, each institution has different problems, and not being able to identify what do you want to solve is basically the first step. Once you know that, for example, in one institution we work with, everyone passes, so they're not worried about retention, but they were more interested, how can we make sure that everyone passes with the highest grade possible, for example. That's a different challenge than, for example, what we have at the Open University, where lots of students are basically coming to the Open University not really knowing what they're studying, for example, and thus their retention rates are sometimes lower than in other institutions. But we are open to all students, so obviously there are different problems. So identifying the problem is the first step. Then identifying, okay, who would be good people to work on these problems is key, and bringing a multidisciplinary team to be able to see how you can address that problem. And the third one that I continue to repeat, it's not about the technology, it's not about the algorithms, it's about the people. So trying to understand what drives people to help you as an organization to make that change, that's the hardest part. And I spend most of my time talking to people rather than, you know, computer programmers developing algorithms. So that's my 3 tips. Ethics and privacy is a core of learning analytics. And this is also one of the first things we did at the Open University in 2014. So we established an ethics policy on learning analytics. I think we're the first university in the world to have an ethics policy. And this is publicly available for people to basically use and reuse. And what we try to do is to establish principles with all the stakeholders. So including educators, including managers of data, but most importantly, of course, our students, and being really upfront with what we do with data, but also what we don't do with data. And what we have done after establishing those principles is to continuously have the dialogue with our stakeholders. I'm just making up one variable that I know we discussed a lot within the Open Universities, for example, ethnicity, and whether it's important to include this variable or not. And we can see from a modeling that ethnicity quite quickly disappears in terms of a predictive variable. Yeah, some stakeholders are keen to keep that variable in, even though it doesn't predict anything. And others are like, well, we should just remove it. So by having the dialogue with students and with other stakeholders, we hopefully can bring people at the table, and we are very clear and upfront which data we use and which data we will not use for following and supporting our students, and we make that explicit the moment you start at the Open University. I think if done well, it works really well, and we've done already a lot of research on practical implementations. For example, at Maastricht University, there's an adaptive program that helps students through their mathematics and statistics courses, which is completely adaptive. And we see that people start at different points in terms of their mathematics skills, but also at different points in terms of interest. And we can see that from the data, if we provide these more personalized pathways, that works for many. But I agree with you that you don't study at a university just on yourself in an individual room. You also want to meet other people. And I think the real power of personalized learning is if we are able to also tap into what students' needs and wants are. So one of my battles that I haven't won yet at the Open University is, I mean, some of our students really love working together and others absolutely hate it. So why not design exactly the same course, but provide it in 2 different formats, or 3 or 4 or whatever is needed, and making sure that once it is well designed, that you still have the same learning outcomes. And we can easily do this with learning analytics, but people tend to be a little bit afraid of, oh yeah, but this will lead to lots of complexity, it's difficult. But technically it is possible, and I think it's really powerful, because I mean, no one goes to a clothing shop and all wearing the same t-shirts. Everyone wants some slightly different experiences. So why are we not providing this at scale also to our learners? And we can see from the learning analytics data that people need these different skills and traits. So I think that is the real future in the next 5-6 years. I mean, my personal take on this, and I've seen this over many institutions, is that technology is not necessarily the biggest hurdle. Any kind of technology, even the most simplest discussion forum, can be used really powerfully or really badly. So it's all about how do teachers and students, work together on this. So I think the biggest barrier is not the technology, but the people and how they are intending to use the technology. So oftentimes, just as an anecdote, some teachers say, yeah, discussion forums don't work. And then I'm always wondering, okay, but how do you then use the discussion forums? Is it embedded in the design? Is it useful that people work together? Or is it just, oh, I'm just going to turn a button online, but no one clicks on that button? And I think the second challenge, which we also talked previously, is the professional development, both of students and of teachers, of, okay, if we think it is important that people work together in groups, well, how can we best support them? How can we encourage people to work together? And that sometimes need a little bit of encouragement for people. And there, again, professional development is really important. The provocative me would say, I think there will be 2 types of institutions in 20 years' time. One is, the top leading institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, MIT, which will continuously attract the top talent students. And at the other extreme will be online universities that really know how to effectively support individual students. And my guess would be is that there will be a kind of segregation into different types of universities over time. That's one extreme I see. The other scenario I see is that increasingly the boundaries between normal traditional face-to-face education and online education will disappear. So it could also be that in 20 years' time, all universities have an open university model. And perhaps the Open University in 20 years' time doesn't exist because every university does this. So there are all these extremes. I'm not sure which one we will go to. I will primarily focus on two messages. So one is, how can you implement learning analytics in your own institution if you're thinking about this? And the second thing, which I think is really exciting, is that I will provide a sneak preview of some of our latest learning design approaches. And it's really exciting. And perhaps you can use that learning design also in your own education.